Hello, my name is Cheryl Letterly, and I work in the Education Outreach Department at the Library of Congress. We are thrilled to welcome you to the second annual online conference for educators. Our session today, Teaching with Historical Newspapers. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Megan Hosband is a reference librarian in the Serials and Government Publication Division of the Library of Congress. She is part of a team of reference librarians that work in the newspaper and current periodical reading room to provide on-site and off-site reference assistance for the library's newspaper, periodical, and government documents collections. Megan also serves as a specialist for the library's comic book collections. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, and welcome everybody. Hopefully we'll get some good discussion during today's session, and I'll just go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to talk with you about Chronicling America, an ongoing resource from the National Digital Newspaper Program, which is a collaboration between the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and state partners. We frequently get the question, why use newspapers? Are newspapers primary sources? And yes, they are. That's the answer we generally give. A more in-depth explanation would be primary sources are the raw materials of history, original documents and objects which were created at the time under study. They are different from secondary sources, accounts or interpretations of events created by someone without firsthand experience. So what is Chronicling America? Chronicling America is digitized copies of historic newspapers from across the United States. We recently expanded the date coverage to include issues of newspapers from the early press of the U.S. Capitals, so going back to 1789. Currently 43 state partners, DC and Puerto Rico participate, and we have over 11 million pages. The goal of the program has been to enhance access to historic American newspapers, hopefully from every state and territory once we progress long enough, to apply emerging technologies to the products of the U.S. newspaper program, including Chronicling America, to develop best practices for the digitization of historic newspapers and to provide free and open content that's available to everyone. Here's a map of the current participating state partners. We have over 300,000 pages in French, Italian, German, Spanish, and Finnish. And actually, as of this year, awardees will have the option to select any public domain content published, even published after 1922. I believe the date range for that goes up to 1963. So in the coming years, we will actually have additional content past 1922. There's over 2,000 titles at the moment. The titles that were actually selected for inclusion were selected by the state partners themselves. Generally, they're not available elsewhere online and were identified by the state partners as at risk for loss without preservation. Something you might note is that there are only select dates available for each title. Sometimes this can be because there were only a certain number of issues that were available at the time of digitization. Sometimes those are the only issues that exist anywhere. Each title is researched and selected by the state partners, as I mentioned, and if the state partner continues the program and identifies additional issues, I believe they do try to add new issues as they are discovered. All right, so what you might notice is the search bar that's on the home page of Chronicling America. This is the sort of default search. We call it the simple search. You can select a state, a date range by year, and then enter keywords in. The searching is a proximity search, so it will search with the words that you type in within 5 words of one another. And generally, we find that this is pretty useful for most keyword searching. Once you've entered a keyword search, what you'll see is something like this. I did a search for presidential election. The results allow you to visually scan the pages and take note of how many times the terms appear on the page. So the red blocks that you see there, you can kind of observe whether the terms are part of the headline, whether they're a caption from an image, whether there are any images or not. Excuse me. The default sort is relevance, but you can change that to date, title, or state, I believe. Something that you might find useful as well is seeing how many times the terms appear on the page. Pages that have fewer words total per page will rank higher. So it can be, as you can see here, where ads will come up first, but sometimes the ads are actually very interesting. For a variety of reasons. They include images, and it kind of gives you a feeling of what popular reaction was like. What you might notice here is that you can see that there are some ways of sorting and limiting, as I mentioned, but also that this search resulted in 130,245 results containing presidential election, which is quite a few. You can limit it to show only front pages. Often front page results include headlines or images, which you might find useful in the classroom. Another way to limit might be to select a particular state or a particular date range. But you can also use the advanced search feature to narrow your results further. So this is the advanced search page. And just in case you have not discovered this yet, all of the pages, the images should be hyperlinked. So you can go back to the page or go into the page on your own later. So as I mentioned, excuse me, the simple search defaults to what I call the proximity search, which you see in the lower left corner. The advanced search allows you to do a couple different types of searching: the any, all, and the phrase search. You can also enter a more specific date range than years. It allows you to select from a calendar view, which can be useful if you know that you're looking for reporting on a particular event, say, the election of 1860, and reporting on that. So from November 1860, you could search for presidential election and get a more narrow result list. One thing to bear in mind when using the date range, though, is that instantaneous news may not have been the norm during the time period that you're researching. Even though technological advances such as telegraph and cable wire, cable news service existed, instantaneous reporting was not the norm, and so it could take days for events that happened on the East Coast to be reported on the West Coast, and vice versa, especially the earlier you get. So to go back to the search results, sorry, that's a little blurry. What you'll see is individual pages with the keywords you selected highlighted in red. This we call hit highlighting, and it allows, as I mentioned, you to visually browse. Something that I wanted to mention was that sometimes you might find that the expected language or keywords that you're using are not actually used during the time period. Similarly, headlines were not used in the same way that they are today. One example that I will show in a little bit is actually the election of 1860. Headlines did not read like they did in, even 1916. It just said election across one tiny part of the page. Just bear that in mind when you're searching. It may depend on the time period, what kind of results you're getting. Sometimes you can also get additional useful keywords by reading some of the articles that you might not have thought of as well. So clicking on one of the results pages will show you this. Each page has a permanent link. It will allow you to view the entire page, include the highlighted keywords. It includes citation information at the top and bottom and a persistent link at the bottom, which is not pictured here, but I will talk about it in a minute. And this is the toolbar that's on every page. From left to right, you'll see the zoom in, zoom out buttons, the home button, the full screen button. The image drop-down menu actually allows you to navigate between pages of the issue. You can also navigate between pages or view all the pages of an issue. Click through the issues, see all issues of that particular title, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's what we call the calendar view. You can also view the text behind the image, save the image as a PDF or a JPEG-2 file, or clip a detail from the image, which I'll go over in a couple minutes. So the zoom feature allows you to focus on the keywords that you found or read smaller text in a particular page. What you can see on this image here, hopefully, is that the zoom feature is outlined in red in the box on the top right corner. So I've used this as an example where if you want to say clip this image as a detail, what you would do would be to go to that clipping tool that's on the right of the toolbar, and it will allow you to save a JPEG of that image for your use, which you can repurpose into presentations, online presentations. You can print out, save the file. As I mentioned, all of the material that's available here is freely available. There's no known rights restrictions associated with this material. It should all be in the public domain as far as the library is aware, so you and your students can feel free to use this material for your research and your presentations. And one thing people find particularly useful is that permanent link, which you see I've kind of tried to highlight here. That's the same link that's at the bottom of every page. It doesn't include the keyword hit highlighting, but it will always get you back to that same page. And as you can see, there's a link to print the image as well as downloading the image. So one thing I forgot to say, you don't have to be on the clipping tool to get to that persistent link. It's on every page. And the zoom feature allows you to kind of control, the type of image that you end up downloading. So in addition to some of those tools, one thing that you might find useful along with the digitized content from Chronicling America are the newspaper histories that were created by the National Digital Newspaper Program participants. These histories tell the story of newspapers selected for digitization and how they fit into the state's history. These histories can provide context for the newspaper and enable you and your students to provide a more in-depth analysis of the materials. For example, let me go to this next one. So what you'll see is a link to the calendar view, and then the beginning of that essay here on the New York Tribune and New York Daily Tribune. This can be particularly significant if you are researching, for example, political elections. Did the paper have a party affiliation? In the 19th century, many newspapers were either Republican or Democratic and had a very specific political stance. If you're researching the Civil War, you might see was this newspaper published in a northern or a southern state, and all of this information can impact how you read the content that you're finding in the newspapers. So I just picked out a quick example here. This particular clipping says election results, hurrah. Buck and Breck on their heads. It doesn't actually say Lincoln elected, but that's what it's talking about. It's from a November 1860 issue of the Nebraska Advertiser, which was decidedly Republican. And as the essay says, the editor was actually a great admirer of President Lincoln. And he had a feisty attitude towards bourbon Democrats, i.e., Southern Democrats. So I found this image pretty funny. But you'll find little gems like this throughout. And sometimes, it really does require kind of just browsing and seeing what's available. But you can, on occasion, find funny things like this. As I was kind of talking about, depending on what you are researching, may depend kind of how you utilize Chronicling America. But something you might find useful for your classroom are the recommended topics, which are guides to various subjects and periods using newspapers and Chronicling America. So whether you need some ideas for projects for your students, or just kind of want to get a feel of how we might suggest you use some of the newspapers, you'll find quite a variety of examples here. There are over 250 topics pages which have been created by LC reference staff, which are organized by subject as well as date range. There's also just a generic alphabetical list of topics pages, which just has the full list. And we're creating new ones all the time. And if there's something that you don't see on our list that you would like, send us an Ask a Librarian question, which the link will be at the end of this presentation, and let us know. We're happy to take suggestions because we really want teachers to find these useful and to be able to have their students use them in the classroom. So each of these pages, as I mentioned, addresses a variety of topics, but one consistent thing that you'll find throughout them is that they include links to, or a list of important dates, suggested search terms and strategies, and then links to sample articles. So here you'll see some suggested search strategies, and then some sample links. Generally, the topics, they're bigger hits. It's not an exhaustive resource, and given that we're continuously adding additional content to Chronicling America, the results that you actually get using the keywords will change over time. There will be additional information that you might find, additional articles. We just have selected or curated some that we find, interesting because of their perspective or their, a headline or an image that they've included. And we try to include newspapers from across the country when creating these, not just focusing on the East Coast. As you can see, we have the Los Angeles Herald, the Seattle Star, the New York Tribune, and the Pensacola, Florida Journal. And so, trying to get a wide perspective on this particular election. And we try to do that with all of them. I just selected a few of the, since we mentioned that we're going to be focusing this presentation on presidential elections, I listed a few of the topics pages that we've created specifically related to elections. So what you'll see here are links to these elections. Chronicling America is similar to newspapers.com in a certain way and very different in another way. Chronicling America is a free resource. So, everything that we have from the images to the data behind it is all open and viewable. newspapers.com and other services like that generally don't tend to make all of that information available. That being said, they also have the ability to include content that is protected by US copyright if they are able to obtain clearance, which we do not provide any access to copyrighted content. So that would be, I think, one of the major differences. I do like as well that we've decided to include newspapers that are at risk for loss. There's actually a surprising number of materials that are not available in libraries and not available that are not widely available. And so sometimes you only find issues in special collections. And so hopefully through this program, we're kind of making more of that material available. The newspaper and current periodical reading room staff actually has an RSS feed, which we highlight certain topics in Chronicling America, as well as this day in history and other things, which you can subscribe to through the Chronicling America homepage if you're at all interested. We try to do it about once a week. We don't try to spam everybody, but you'll also be able to get announcements about when we add new content to Chronicling America or when we reach certain milestones. A year and a half ago or so, when we reached 10 million pages, we kind of talked that up a little bit, but sometimes we find very funny things on this day in history that are kind of fun. So using the zoom and the clipping tool can help overcome some of that tiny print and or fading. You can also download the JPEG, and then if you have an image editor of some kind, use that to enhance the contrast, and that can sometimes help with the readability. Part of the issue with some of that material is that that was the best copy that was available to digitize from, whether it was original or microfilm. And so there isn't really a whole lot that we can do about it now outside of using an image editing software, because the raw material was in that bad of shape. I generally tend to use the clipping tool and then an image editor. You don't even have to have something like Photoshop. You can just use something very simple, and just increasing the contrast does help. Another set of topics pages that we've created are kind of events related to presidential administrations. So, for example, the impeachment of Andrew Jackson, or Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which was kind of the celebratory event that happened after his presidency, where he sent the Navy off on a worldwide expedition. The Cleveland's cancerous growth is actually a fairly popular one as well, just because it's kind of strange, and I forget exactly what it says. I think he has some sort of abscess in his jaw. There's a lot of strange things that kind of come up in newspapers. Sometimes viewing the PDF can be more helpful. It can, depending on how often that page that you're looking at has been accessed. It may take a minute for it to load. A lot of web browsers keep a cache, and so if it hasn't really been loaded much, your web browser may take a minute to load the entire page and resolve it. Just bear that in mind, because they can be fairly large files. So I've included a number of links here at the end of the presentation. The first link, obviously, is to Chronicling America. The second link is to Ask a Librarian, which is our online reference service. As I've mentioned, you can select and most of the new library's reading rooms, including newspaper and current periodical. Don't worry, though, if you don't know which reading room to select. The librarians across the library know when to refer it to other reading rooms. Excuse me. So, if you're not sure of where to send it, don't worry about it. There's a direct link to the recommended topics, which we were talking about just now. and you can find that whole list by subject or date range. Um, the the Always Great teachers page there in the middle, which has links to a number of resources, including the Analyzing Newspapers Teacher's Guide, which I haven't really talked about here in this presentation much, but that can be quite useful with your students when you've identified an article for them to look at, and so it provides them with kind of questions about how to take a look at the newspaper, who was writing it, who was the audience of the time, is it an ad, is it an opinion piece, how what's the context for this, and so that guide can be really useful when you're working with your students and newspapers. The are you guys the Education Outreach Office does have a great blog, which has a number of posts that include chronicling references to Chronicling America and using newspapers. There's actually a few links in the next couple slides. Dana just mentioned that if you're trying to access Chronicling America right now, you may get an error message because there's a lot of use right now. So sorry about that. Just keep trying. Hopefully it will eventually catch up. And as Cheryl mentioned, yeah, the Teacher's Guide offers questions to help your students look more closely and think more deeply, and then activities for following up on that. And in some of the guides, they'll pair newspapers with materials from the prints and photographs section and other areas of the library, so that can be really useful and interesting. Some K-12 resources, just specifically, there is actually a special prize for the best use of Chronicling America for National History Day, in case you're doing National History Day. And then the National Endowment for the Humanities has developed a number of teacher resources as well. So these are some links to some of the primary source sets developed by the Education Outreach Office, which include newspaper materials. Women's suffrage is particularly relevant given some of the examples that I brought in earlier. Votes for Women, it was an ad about presidential elections before actually the 19th Amendment occurred. I believe that was from 1906, so it was before universal suffrage. So that might be something interesting if you're interested in that topic, looking at votes for women pre-universal suffrage versus post-universal suffrage. The Spanish-American War has been continually a popular topic as well. A lesson plan on the Titanic, which Cheryl actually wrote, and it's quite good. And then some links to some of the blog posts that include references to Chronicling America and newspapers. Again, the Titanic, 12 Years a Slave, presidential elections. I was trying to do a little bit of digging on some presidential elections, and I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, one of the curious things when I was looking at Lincoln's first election was how the newspapers reported it, and there were 6 to 8 columns of text in the newspapers at the time, and sometimes the only headline that you got was election across one of the columns. It wasn't a full page headline. Sorry, Jody, you're correct. 19th Amendment is not equal to universal suffrage. Sorry, you're right. So the election of 1860 was interesting, not only because of looking at how it was covered in the newspapers, but also depending on whether the newspaper was from a northern or a southern state. I found a few reports from Louisiana papers and Virginia papers, which even 2, 3, 4 days after the election would not acknowledge that Lincoln had actually been elected. The text was kind of saying if Lincoln is elected, or if the black something about like the black Democrat or the black Republican. It was something very interesting. So I think, students would have an interesting time kind of looking at how the coverage of a particular election, happened depending on where the newspaper was published. And I pulled a little an image here. It's at the Hawaiian Star that included some interesting. I forget if these are. I think these are lithographs of the presidential candidates. And what might be interesting to students now that I was discovering is, for a very long time there were generally four parties. Even up until about 100 years ago, four or more parties that were participating in the presidential election. It wasn't just a two-party race. And so here you can see the four candidates, which I thought was kind of interesting.